Cyberpunk, The Flame That Remains. Written and read by Ethan Taplin. Chapter 7, Embers, Night City, 2075. Fuck! Sophie wanted to scream, but her voice refused to come forth. Her heart pounded painfully in her aching chest. Fire blazing out of control. Fuel supply overabundance. The Naustrand hallway had returned. Sophie stood alone. 1,000 eyes stared at her from the surrounding darkness. She wanted nothing more than to stop, to give up. Why had she decided she had to know what was left in the salvaged AI fragments? Why had she salvaged them at all? What was the point? She tried to scream again. The sound was distant and muffled. The digital halls remained silent, though she could faintly feel the sound tearing at her throat. The hallway stretched into the darkness, eclipsed both ahead of her and behind. It was the same hall she had been wandering, but it was different somehow, more still. The ravens emerged from the blackness, landing at her feet. One stared at Sophie, the other into the dark hallway ahead. Sophie followed its gaze, trying to make out whatever had captured its attention. What am I supposed to be seeing? What do you want to show me? As her thought floated down the hall, she saw it. A door appeared in the center of the path. Not silver, not sterile. Wood. Worn. Familiar. It was the door to the rec room. Sophie pushed the door open and found herself in a new section of the Naustrand complex. Not the part she remembered from training or cold briefings. This room breathed quietly, its edges softened by false warmth, its details preserved in painful clarity. The rec room was dimly illuminated by hidden ceiling lights. The walls were lined with warped bookshelves and old couches that looked soft but were filled with foam too stiff to relax on. Someone had scratched patterns into the vinyl with a scalpel long ago. It was exactly as she remembered. Somewhere within, someone was humming. Sophie moved further into the room and found Astrid sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of a false fireplace. Lit by the flames flickering on the screen, Astrid's posture was perfect, her back straight, hands resting on her knees. Astrid had been 15 when Sophie formed this memory, but there was something ancient in her stillness. She wasn't meditating, she wasn't praying, she was listening. The ravens landed beside Astrid. She didn't even look up. Sophie stood behind her, outside the memory, unsure what to do. Would her memories reject her if she looked too close? Astrid gestured with 2 fingers, a silent invitation. Sophie entered the room. At the same time, the younger Sophie, the one who belonged in the scene, emerged from the shadows, sitting beside Astrid. It was the ghost who had lived this memory at 12 years old. For a long time, neither spoke. Do you ever wish you were someone else? Astrid didn't answer right away. Her breathing remained slow and deliberate. The light of the fire caught the edges of her features, making her look as though she were carved from glass. No, she said finally, without opening her eyes. But sometimes I wish I didn't know who I was. Sophie blinked. It wasn't the answer she'd expected. She shifted where she sat, pulling her knees to her chest. Why? Astrid's voice was soft, nearly lost beneath the ambient hum of the facility. Because knowing means seeing the patterns, and seeing the patterns means knowing where they end. And where do they end? I wish I did not know. Sophie didn't understand, not really, but something in the words made her feel smaller, like she'd stepped into the shadow of something she couldn't name. She looked at her sister again, tried to read Astrid's face for clues. She was unreadable. You always talk like that, Sophie murmured. Would you prefer a lie? Maybe. Astrid cracked one eye open, looking at her sidelong. Then yes, sometimes I wish I was someone else, Someone softer, someone slower. Someone who didn't have a voice in her head telling her how every conversation will end before it begins. Is that your implant? Astrid gently touched her temple. The Rippers say it's predictive modeling, probability trees, risk assessment. It identifies itself as Heimdall. Mother calls me a vulva, a cirrus. She smiled, sad and dry. I'd call it loneliness. The room fell quiet again, but the air between them felt fuller than before. Sophie hugged her knees tighter, burying her face in them. I don't think I'm meant to be anything, she said, unsure if she was speaking to Astrid or herself. Just used. Astrid reached out, not for her hand, but for her shoulder. It was a steady, anchoring touch. What would I be like if I wasn't made this way? You'd still be you, Astrid whispered, but with less fire. Would that be better? Astrid's eyes looked at Sophie, then looked past her. Her eyes seemed to bore into the elder Sophie, the one watching, the observer within the simulation. You are still becoming, she said. Before either Sophie could reply, the room flickered and froze. The door behind them filled with light. The ravens stood by, ever watchful. Fire trajectory unstable. System attempting redirection. Sophie stood slowly as the room faded into pixelated obscurity, taking Astrid with it. Thank you. A tear rolled down her cheek and into the icy tub. The corridor returned, along with the unseen eyes. They stared down at Sophie from outside, unblinking, unmoving, penetrating deep into her soul. The ravens watched with them, taking in every movement. But the longer she spent with them, the less she wished they would leave. She felt that as long as the ravens watched her, the other eyes could do no more than watch as well. The corridor changed again, this time with no fanfare, no flickering lights or spiraling dread. It simply softened, became quieter. The angles of the walls relaxed, the colors grew gentler. She felt as though the world had exhaled slowly and was ready to take a deep breath. Sophie walked without urgency. The ravens followed in her wake. Ahead, she saw it. The faintest glow rising through a curved glass dome. Pale light flowed down from a tangle of cables overhead, veins of orange and white, and deep, unnatural blue. They pulsed faintly, webbing outward in an elegant sprawl like roots or branches. Prosopon's core hung suspended above, forever out of reach. Below the core, in one of the 9 domes encircling it, Sophie slept. She lay curled beneath a thin blanket, her breath shallow and uneven. The glowing conduits above gently illuminated the dome as they reached out like they were seeking to touch her, to take her back. Liv stood just inside the door. She hadn't knocked, hadn't wished to wake the girl whose blood she had spilled mere hours ago. She lingered there, one hand clenched around the small data slate pressed to her chest. Sophie didn't stir. The girl had always slept like this after surgery, guarded, small, her hands drawn in as if protecting something only she could feel. Liv knew this posture. She'd caused it, over and over again. She stepped closer, moving to her sister's bedside. The slate beeped as it found Sophie's biomonitor signal, displaying the information for Liv to read. Neural oscillation within normal ranges, implant harmonics stabilizing, cortical loop bleed minimal. Everything was green. It didn't matter. Sophie watched her elder sister lean over the sleeping form of the other her. Liv pulled the blanket up around Sophie's shoulders, her hand briefly pausing to trace a finger along the metal jutting out along the little girl's spine. You're sleeping now. That's good, Liv whispered. It'll help you heal. voice cracked, just enough to hurt. She sat down on the edge of the bed, caressing Sophie's cheek. It was wet. "You always cry in your sleep. Did you know that?" She laughed, a quiet, hollow sound. "I wanted to tell them no." Her voice was almost childlike. Sophie could feel the weight of the scene closing in around her, not with force, but with shame. "I thought, if I learned fast enough, if I did everything right, maybe they wouldn't ask me to do it. But I was the only one who could thread you safely. Because your pain threshold was lower. Because your neural sync was unpredictable. Because your nervous system fought back." She stepped away from the bed as though it would burn her. "You screamed so loudly, Sophie. And I couldn't even flinch. I had to keep going, keep inflicting pain." Liv slumped into a chair across the room. She pressed the heels of her palms into her eyes. "I couldn't stop. I had to keep going because if I hesitated, I'd fail. And if I failed, you'd die. I told myself I was helping you, that you'd be proud later, that you'd be strong, that I was giving you something better than the body you were born with. All excuses for my own weakness. You never got to choose." She withdrew her hands from her face and looked again at the sleeping child. Her eyes brimmed with tears, hot and useless. They clung to her lashes before falling one by one to the floor. "I should have denied them. Should have given you the choice to remain soft, to remain real." Liv's breath hitched, and soon she was sobbing, begging for forgiveness. The young girl in the bed couldn't hear her, but from outside the scene, Sophie wished once more that her virtual body would allow her to cry. "I forgave you," she said softly. Inside the memory, Liv shook her head, almost like she'd heard. "You should never have had to." Fire reduced. Smoldering core stable. The hallway did not return this time. It snapped. Sophie was no longer watching. She was there. The shift came with a crackle, static running over her skin, a flicker in her teeth like lightning. Then concrete beneath her feet, a wet, heavy fog filling her vision, and the drumming of her heart in her ears. She knew this memory well. Not because she was fond of it, no. She feared it for how much it had hurt. They were somewhere in the outskirts of Brno, in the Czech Republic, a biotechnica testing ground. Patrolling the facility was a small army of chrome-heavy biotechnica security, GeneWatch operatives from the look of their loadouts, and it seemed they had been authorized to use lethal force. "Check corners," Freya, Asgard, called out. Sophie moved with careful precision, identifying vulnerabilities in the complex's ice walls as she went. She peeked through the cameras as she moved, marking enemy locations for her team. A drone patrolled the catwalks above her. A quick hack overloaded its optics and fried its targeting software. A hooded figure emerged from a nearby shadow, and with quiet precision, finished the job. The drone dropped silently onto the catwalk at Alfheim's feet. Sophie's vision crackled as she closed out the display of the camera loop. Jotunheim passed her flank without a word. Ahead of him, Sophie marked another target. This one was human, real. Sophie scanned, breached, and disabled his optics and cyberlegs in a single, seamless flow. The man collapsed to the ground like so much meat. Jotunheim paid the collapsing target no mind, rushing past it to take cover behind a nearby piece of machinery. Sophie joined him. A few yards ahead, they could see 3 red outlines, targets Sophie had marked while she was in the camera system. As long as Sophie remained connected to the enemy's systems, their positions would be displayed to her siblings via their optical implants and updated in real time by their own camera feeds. Jotunheim checked the ammo in his weapon, sliding the magazine back into the rifle with a click that left him looking satisfied. Just as he was about to leap over their cover, a voice rang out inside their heads. "Hold position, Jotunheim." It was Svartalfheim, speaking over their internal agents. His command was followed quickly by the whirring of a drone. The machine swooped down on the outlined combatants, the lights on its surface flashing several times as it approached and promptly exploded. With no further reason to stay hidden, Jotunheim ducked out of cover and sprinted ahead, running toward their objective, marked on their visual displays with a golden glyph. The target was a black box server core in the facility's east wing, a cache of unregulated biotech experiments that Prozapon had told them must be scrubbed from Biotechnica's archives. Sophie and her teammates had marked more than 30 enemies remaining between their current position and the golden icon. At least half were scattered around the room Jotunheim had just entered. Sophie ran after Jotunheim but couldn't keep up. He was taller and faster, and his cybernetic legs had been designed to enhance his already incredible speed. He turned a corner, and Sophie watched two of the outlined figures vanish as gunfire rang out. Asgard was leading from a remote position. Svartalfheim was far behind Sophie, and Alfheim wasn't equipped for an all-out brawl against that many. Asgard's voice echoed in her mind again. "Jotunheim, you can't take on all of them on your own!" Sophie could almost hear the expression of frustration on Asgard's face. She kept running, glancing up to see Alfheim just ahead of her up in the rafters. More gunfire rang out, followed by a shout from Jotunheim. "Fuck! You're right, there are too many of them. I'm down and they're mobilizing to extract the objective." Sophie slid into cover, accessing the camera feeds again. She saw Jotunheim crouched behind a low wall, clutching his side. He'd obviously been hit. Blood was staining his white armor plates and smeared across the wall. His cyberware was spitting sparks, from which Sophie surmised he'd also been zapped by a netrunner. Sophie was formulating a plan on how to extract Jotunheim and at least emerge from the mission without any fatalities on their part. But Asgard's voice came again, sharp and clipped with authority. "Muspelheim, breach cover. Activate your speedware." The command snapped against Sophie's nerves. She was suddenly and uncomfortably aware of the metal plating that ran down her back. She froze behind the cover, her breath caught mid-chest. Not again. The hum of the spinal implant tickled the base of her skull. The speedware was already sinking, ready to thread her perception through the eye of a needle. All it would take was her thinking about it a little too hard. Time would stretch, sounds would distort, her thoughts would fracture into unbearable clarity. And when it ended, her body would scream. "Muspelheim, now!" Another burst of gunfire erupted ahead. She watched the enemy outlines flicker. One dropped, the others scattered. Alfheim and Svartalfheim closed on Jotunheim's position. The objective marker was being surrounded by red enemy outlines. 3 more were returning to where Jotunheim lay, ready to finish the job. "I can handle this without it," Sophie whispered to herself. She took a deep breath, then repeated herself across the comm channel. She surged forward, her breath shallow. Her hidden weapon whispered as it slid free from the port in her left wrist. She pulled the monomolecular whip free and sprinted past her siblings as they were lifting Jotunheim off the ground. Alfheim reached out to stop her, but Sophie broke her grasp. She rounded another corner and let the monowire sing. It passed through the first target before he could raise his weapon. She ducked, dropping low to the floor as she flicked her wrist and sent the filament slicing through the second soldier's knees, blood spattering across her armor. The third turned to fire, only to find that one of Sophie's quick hacks had overloaded his smart gun, causing his bullets to ricochet wildly around the room before embedding themselves in his head. The soldiers didn't have time to scream before they went down, but she saw pain carved into their faces as they slumped onto the floor. Real blood, real death. This wasn't a simulation. Not anymore. Sophie breathed hard as she continued her approach, charging up several flights of stairs. Just before she burst onto the facility rooftop, she reached into the cameras again, pinpointing the 3 of her enemies with the thinnest ice. Their outlines glowed in her mind's eye. She blinked, and the code began to unfold. A virus wormed its way past their defenses, snagging any offensive demons they had, corrupting and passing them on to the next target. The virus worked faster and faster with every downed target until the code had devoured itself, and only a few remained. Sophie didn't stop moving. The monowire hissed once, twice. 2 more corpse soldiers fell. One was severed cleanly in half at the waist. The other fell to his knees as his head dropped to the floor behind him. Sophie approached the last few Biotechnica soldiers guarding the black box server as it was loaded onto a vehicle for extraction. Rain plastered her hair to her face. The monowire was pulled taut in her grip. As thin as it was, a few droplets still managed to hit the wire, hissing as they were sliced apart. She steadily approached the soldiers as the VTOL engines of their evac vehicle roared to life. The wire severed the first soldier from his life. The second soldier raised his weapon. Sophie scanned him mid-stride. Standard optical package and a cyber arm equipped with a smart gun link and recoil damper. All hackable. All undefended. Her quick hack Q was loaded with a thought, and with another, it was unleashed. His eyes shut down, his arm locked in place. The weapon dropped from fingers that were no longer under his control. The monowire hissed again, and the soldier hit the ground. She was 2 steps from the landing platform now. Only one soldier remained between her and the server core. He was older, weathered. Squared shoulders, heavier cybernetics braced into his frame, reinforced subdermal armor, hydraulic joints. His personal ice wall shone in her eyes. This one wasn't going to fold. Behind him, the giant metal box containing the black box server was being hoisted onto the VTOL's ramp by an automated loader. Countdown flashes burned in the drenched sky. 10 seconds to liftoff. Sophie lunged forward. She flicked her wrist, sending the wire whipping around her enemy. At the same time, she dove to the side and began to breach his ice. A single hole in his defense was all she needed. But the moment she moved, so did he. His movements were fast, augmented, unnaturally fluid. He slipped through the monowire with ease and raised his weapon. As she stared down the barrel of his gun, Sophie knew what would happen next. Knew the speedware threaded through her central nervous system was already humming, ready to stretch her consciousness into razor-thin time. She could dodge, outpace the bullet. She could slide past him and sever his neck before his eyes even registered that she'd moved. All she had to do was give in, submit to the Sandevistan, let it take her. She refused. She didn't need it. She was wrong. He pulled the trigger. Pain exploded in her side, white hot, red blooming. Her knees buckled and her ears rang. Her thoughts fell away from anything but the wound. The monowire slackened and hung loosely around her fingers. She hit the ground hard, gasping harder. The VTOL engines screamed overhead, wind slicing down around her. Her vision blurred as the black box was lifted away. The grizzled soldier stood over her, weapon trained, but didn't fire again. She heard footsteps. Someone crashed through the door onto the rooftop to join them. She heard Jotunheim shouting over the storm. Alfheim's silhouette dropped into view, blades drawn. A spray of blood cast out around her, and the soldier went down. Sophie's vision fragmented. Her biomon screamed at her, and errors cascaded across her eyesight. Someone grabbed her beneath the arms, dragging her toward cover. Eventually, the rain stopped falling and was replaced with the sounds of her siblings arguing. "Fucking idiot! I told her to use it!" That was Asgard. "She had it! She had the shot!" Svartalfheim snapped. "The objective's gone because she froze again!" Asgard snarled. "Shut the hell up, all of you! She's bleeding out!" That was Vanaheim's voice, sharp with fury. "You can settle this later!" Sophie tried to speak, but her lips wouldn't move. Her field of view narrowed until the world was only flashes. Blue sparks from Alfheim's blade, Jotunheim's scowl, Asgard pacing like a caged animal. Svartalfheim alone remained still and silent. Only Liv knelt beside her, hands red and shaking. She touched Sophie's cheek and whispered something too soft to hear. Her fingers pressed over the wound. Everything turned gray, then cold, then it was all gone. Fuel depleted. No flame detected. Embers dimming. Sophie gasped for air as if emerging from deep waters. She was freezing, shivering, still half submerged in her tub. For a heartbeat, she couldn't trust what she was seeing. The colors of her apartment were too bright, too saturated, and they revealed 4 figures. Ghosts, that she wished had remained trapped in her past. They stared down at her, cold and naked in the icy bath. Their postures were tense, like they had been arguing. Asgard, Svartalfheim, Jotunheim, and Alfheim. There were no words of comfort, no expressions of joy, just business. Alfheim knelt next to the tub, touching Sophie's arm. "Don't fight," she murmured. "It's already done." Sophie rose to her feet, nearly knocking Alfheim over as she stood. She knew she couldn't fight them like this. She had no armor, and she was already starting to reel after emerging from the dive. She had her monowire, but they each had a gun. Only one option was left to her. Green light coated her back as the Sandevistan began to hum. She could almost feel it reveling in her decision to use it after so long spent dormant. She dreaded this, but there was no other path of escape, no matter how much she hated it. "Sophie, don't!" Alfheim's cry was stretched out as the world screeched to a halt around Sophie. The implant in her spine burst into laughter, mocking, involuntary, and electric. As she leapt from the tub, droplets suspended mid-air, frozen where she had ruptured the water's surface. She took 2 steps and collapsed. Sparks erupted from her spine as she crashed to the ground. Every nerve in her body was on fire. "Shit!" Jotunheim shouted, tackling her. She couldn't have fought him off if she had tried. He grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back, holding her down. Behind them, Asgard said, "We have her. Package secured." She saw Svartalfheim's boots near her face as he approached. "Her vitals are all stable, and the short circuit should have her down for the count for a few hours. You can let her go. She won't be running anytime soon." Jotunheim released her, then moved his grip under her arms and lifted her up. Alfheim opened the dryer and tugged a large hoodie from within, pulling it over Sophie's head before taking her from Jotunheim. In that moment, cradled in her sister's arms like a broken doll, Sophie had never felt more alone. At Asgard's command, they vacated the apartment, leaving behind only a trail of water and a raven staring silently from its perch on the edge of the tub. Sophie didn't know where they were taking her, only that she was free no longer.